Hey there, macro folks. This is Mr. Hooker, and this is Chapter 9, Long Run Economic Growth. So let's get into it. So, benefits and costs of growth. Delhi and Beijing have terrible air quality. Like, it's a thing. It really is hard to breathe. It's almost like Mexico City, I guess, which it's a bad thing, but it's a byproduct of the good thing, which is economic growth. Now, some people get on to them about this, but the thing they don't remember is the U.S. had really bad environmental issues until the 1970s. 1970s. We became a country in 1776. So basically, for 200 years, we didn't care about the environment. And we mad about them? Like, think about that for a minute. Like, when you're first just trying to feed your people and grow a little bit, you do not care about the environment. You don't care about that until you are already established and grown. So that's a key thing about that. Comparing economies across time and space, the thing we use is real GDP per capita. We've talked about real GDP before. Real GDP is the thing we're going to use because we want to use a GDP statistic to measure output, income and output, but we're looking at real GDP because we're comparing times and we're doing per capita because we want to control for population differences. So that's kind of how that works out. Since 80, India and China had a much higher growth rate than the US. So the standard of living achieved in the US in 1900 was attained by China in '08. And as of 2018, India's standard of living is still below that of the US in 1900. So India still hadn't quite hit that. Um, they're working on it. Suppose the real GDP for Micronesia is 200 million in 2010, and suppose the population in Micronesia is 100,000 in 2010. Population increases to 105,000 in 2011 and GDP increases by 5%, then it must be true that real GDP per capita in Micronesia in 2011 didn't increase, didn't decrease, pretty much stayed constant. So there you go. Both went up by 5%. U.S. economy produces almost 8 times as much per person as in 1900. So in 1900, uh, we had 100% of our real GDP per capita. Percentage of 2018 real GDP per capita was 15%. 1920 it was 126 and 18, and then you just keep going down. So there you go. It's just inverses of each other. The U.S. has grown quickly. Some nations have stalled. Some nations just don't have the necessary resources to grow the way you would want. Like you need some natural resources. You need the ability to have physical capital, and you need human capital, which means a good higher education system. Um, so a quarter of the world's population live in countries where the standard of living is lower than it was in the U.S. in 1900. So yellow means that they have less than $1,085, um, and I think that's annually. Yeah, I think that's annually. And then orange, light orange is 1,085 to 4,255. Darker orange is 4,255 to 13,205. And that very burnt orange, very dark, like kind of brown, 13,205 to 25,000. And then the black is greater than or equal to 285,000. So like US, Western Europe, Australia, that's greater than 25,000. And any other countries that are that color. Back to the Future, that's one of the econ movies. Feel free to watch that. It's a good one. Growth rates Had the U.S. managed to produce over 8 times as much real GDP per person in 2018 than in 1900? It's actually a really gradual process. GDP per capita grows by a few percent a year. Helpful thing to do is use rule of 70. Tells us how long it takes for a variable to double. So doubling time for x is 70 divided by the annual growth rate of x. So if real GDP per capita is growing at an annual rate of 3.5%, it will double in 70 divided by 3.5 or 20 years. So basically, slow and steady wins the race. Small improvements in growth add up fast due to the power of compounding. So, how long would it take the average Indian to be as wealthy as the average Western European is? Everything's adjusted for inflation. So, India's GDP per capita is 3,000. Let's assume real output per person grows at 5% a year. Using the rule of 70, how many years would it take for India to reach Italy's current level of GDP per capita, which is about 24,000 a year? So, if you do this math, 70 divided by 5 is 14. So that doubles you from 3,000 to 6,000. You need to then double again from 6 to 12 and then from 12 to 24, right? So you need to double 3 times. So 70 divided by 5 is 14 years. You need to double 3 times. So 14 times 3 is 42. That is the way that math is done, ladies and gentlemen. Hope that makes sense to everyone. Because doubling once gets you to 6, doubling twice gets you to 12. 6 times 2 is 12. 12 times 2 is 24. All right. Comparing recent growth rates, average annual rate of growth, real GDP per capita. China is at 7.6. Ireland's at 3.9. India at 3.8. That's really low for India considering where they are. Bangladesh is at 3.2. US is at 1.6. France at 1.1. Argentina 0.3. Zimbabwe negative 0.5. Not surprising at all. But here's the thing on that, and this is why I say India is surprising for India given where they are. There's what we call the catch-up line. So for those countries with um, lower real GDPs, you should have higher growth rates as you catch up to those with higher GDPs, real GDPs. And once you get closer to the higher real GDPs, your growth rate should slow. So the closer you get, the more it should slow. And it's kind of amazing China's still at 7.6%. I ain't gonna lie. Because I believe that right now they are second in the world in real GDP. Um, so that's kind of crazy that they're still at 7.6% and they're still growing that fast. Although China is brutal, I am not gonna lie. Like the two fighting political parties in China are just brutal with each other. So China tells their ruling party tells its citizens that they have to work hard. That if they don't achieve minimum 7% growth each year, that there won't be enough food for everyone. Period. Like you won't have enough to live. And then the opposition party has gone out and dumped pamphlets in the rural areas of China and just told their people, like, hey, by the way, the rule that they've lied to you. The government has lied. We didn't grow at 7% this past year. You're all going to die. And it's just like crazy the propaganda those two play with each other. It is insane. But hey, that's China. Sources of long run growth. So long run economic growth depends on one ingredient, and that's just rising productivity. So this, when we looked at BLS, I told you like we are a productive nation. Doesn't matter if we gain people, lose people, whatever. Productivity typically rises. So sustained economic growth occurs only when the amount of output produced by the average worker increases steadily. So we're looking at labor productivity, often just called productivity. So typically when we talk about productivity growth, we mean labor productivity. You could also talk about it in terms of capital productivity, but if it's but machines don't do anything without labor. So when you say capital productivity, really you do mean labor productivity. Um, and this is just output per worker. So productivity is simply real GDP divided by the number of people working. So it is what it is. So how does this actually work? Why do we produce so much more than a century ago? Modern workers have far more physical capital, better educated, take advantage of a century's worth of technological progress. Like, you know, y'all are old enough that nobody really like showed you, computers and phones. You just picked one up, started messing with it, and you know how to work it now. You know, I'm of the age somebody had to show me how to work the thing. Um, so there's a whole training process. It's kind of native in your life, but there's a whole, there's training processes for some people on certain things. Um, and so there may be training processes for you know, certain software for you, but that's another thing. So there have been increases in physical capital. That's just man-made resources like buildings and machines. There's also increases in human capital, which you're taking part in now, which is the improvement in labor created by education, knowledge, skills. It's just the knowledge and skills you possess, which make you valuable to the labor force. Okay? It means that you can do stuff. So technological progress is just the advance in technical means of production of a good and service. If we make something that makes it easier to produce something, we use it. If it makes it harder to produce something, we just don't use it. So technology will always move us forward. And if it doesn't, we just don't use it. And that is the way we work that. Uh, so aggregate production function. Uh, so when we change input, how does output change? The aggregate production function is the hypothetical function that shows how productivity, which is real GDP per worker, depends on the quantities of physical capital and human capital per worker. So GDP per worker is equal to T times the physical capital per worker, um, at one third times one third at one third power times human capital per worker, which is two-thirds power. When T is an estimate of the level of technology and human capital is years of education. So physical capital is really only worth a third. Human capital is worth two-thirds. Okay. So note that we exhibit diminishing returns to physical capital. We don't really put as much stock in it as we do the human capital. Like you got to know what you're doing. Um, we don't care as much about the physical capital. So when the amount of human capital per worker and the state of technology are held fixed, each extra unit of physical capital per worker leads to smaller increases in productivity. So in other words, if you're out there and you got stuff, every extra thing I throw at you makes you less productive. So, if I ask you to dig a ditch and I give you a backhoe, that makes you very productive. But if I give you a backhoe and then throw a shovel at you, that does not make you more productive, right? So it's one of those things. So like you've got to understand it's not going to be that much better. So the example they gave, a second computer improves one's productivity, but not by as much as the first computer did. So let's run this one through. Let's run that one through a little bit different than the way they ran it through. Let's say you have a computer, somebody gives you an iPad. That does improve your productivity, but does it double your productivity? No. So there you go. So it makes you more productive, but not twice as productive. So there's some things to this. Um, and that's just the way that they're wanting to look at that. And that's really true if you think about it. So even if they have a computer, they give you an iPad, and they give you a work smartphone, those do not Giving you those two extra devices does not necessarily triple your productivity. Might actually tick you off because now you're going to get phone calls in the middle of the night that they expect answered. You're just gonna like, yeah, no, I ain't doing that. So here's what that looks like. It's going to be like a line that flattens out over time. Real GDP workers at 30,000, physical capital at 20,000. And if you move it up to 50,000 real GDP per worker, you add 20,000, you get 20,000. But if you add another 10,000, if you add another 20,000 in physical capital, you actually only get 10,000 in, so if you add 20,000 in capital the first time, you get 20,000. If you add another 20,000, you get 10,000. So it becomes smaller and smaller as you go out. So you add physical capital, you get less and less real GDP per worker. So it's not the same. It's not dollar for dollar. That's the way that works. All right. Diminishing returns is in other things equal. It holds true when human capital per worker and the technology are held fixed. Um, Diminishing returns may disappear if we increase the amount of human capital per worker or improve technology. In practice, everything contributes to higher productivity over time. Both physical capital and human capital per worker increase as technology advances as well. All right, we will see you in video number 2. Y'all take care.